3 years together. I'd become an expert at defending him to everyone who questioned our relationship. My mom would gently suggest that maybe he should make more effort, and I'd have my response ready before she finished her sentence. "He's going through a lot right now," I'd say. "Work is stressful. He's dealing with family stuff. He's just in a difficult season." My friends would point out concerning patterns, that he rarely initiated plans with me, that he'd cancel last minute, that I seemed to always be accommodating him. And I'd explain it all away. "He shows love differently than I do. Not everyone is naturally affectionate or communicative." Even my therapist would raise gentle questions about whether my needs were being met, whether the relationship felt reciprocal, whether I was doing most of the emotional labor. And I had answers for her too, a whole arsenal of explanations and justifications. Not everyone processes emotions the same way. He's conflict-avoidant, so I need to approach things carefully. He had a difficult childhood, so intimacy is hard for him. I'd spent 3 years building this elaborate defense system, a fortress of rationalizations that protected him from criticism and protected me from seeing what was actually happening. I had a whole script memorized, refined over countless conversations where people had expressed concern or confusion about our relationship. The script was so polished that I could deliver it without thinking, automatically translating his actions into something acceptable, his patterns into something understandable. I believed every word I said. I wasn't lying to them. I genuinely thought I was explaining legitimate differences in how people love, helping them understand him the way I understood him, defending someone who was just misunderstood and needed someone to see past his rough edges. Then one completely ordinary day, I was at work having coffee in the break room with a coworker I didn't know particularly well. She was venting about her boyfriend, and somehow I ended up sharing a bit about mine, about how he'd canceled our weekend plans again, how he hadn't responded to my texts all day, how I was feeling frustrated but trying to be understanding. And she looked at me with this expression I'd seen before and asked the question I'd heard before. "Does he even care about you?" And I started giving my usual response. Started saying those same lines I'd said to my mom, my friends, my therapist. "He's going through a lot right now. He shows love differently. Not everyone is naturally affectionate or good at communication." But this time, as the words came out of my mouth, I heard them. Really heard them. Not as truth, but as script, as performance, as something I'd memorized and repeated so many times it had lost all connection to reality. And I stopped mid-sentence because a question formed in my mind that I couldn't ignore. Why am I working so hard to convince people he cares about me? That question opened something I'd been keeping tightly closed. If he cared about me, if he loved me the way I loved him, wouldn't it be obvious? Wouldn't it be something people could see without me having to explain it, defend it, translate it into language they'd understand? Why did every single person in my life need me to explain how his behavior actually meant he cared, when on the surface it looked like indifference? Why was I constantly doing this interpretive work, this translation from what he did to what I insisted it meant? I started seeing everything differently, like someone had handed me a new prescription for glasses I didn't know I needed. All those explanations I've been giving, they weren't insights into who he was. They were excuses for what he wasn't. He didn't text me all day, and I'd been calling that bad with phones when the truth was simpler. He was choosing not to prioritize staying in contact with me. People aren't bad with phones. They respond to the people and things they care about responding to. His phone worked fine when his friends texted, when work needed him, when something he actually cared about required his attention. He made plans without checking with me first. Dinner with friends on nights we'd talked about spending together. Weekend trips he'd commit to before seeing if I had plans. Decisions about our shared schedule that he'd make unilaterally. I've been calling that spontaneous and independent, framing it as a positive trait, someone who wasn't clingy or overly dependent. But stripped of the generous interpretation, it was just inconsiderate. It was treating my time as less important than his, my plans as more flexible, my presence as optional while his was essential. He shut down whenever I had emotions that weren't positive and easy. If I was upset or stressed or needed to process something difficult, he'd get quiet, withdraw, sometimes leave the room. I've been explaining this as conflict-avoidant, as if that made it acceptable, as if giving it a clinical term meant I should accommodate it rather than expect him to work on it. But it wasn't conflict avoidance. It was emotional unavailability. It was refusing to be present for the hard parts, only wanting the easy parts, treating my emotional needs as burdens he shouldn't have to carry. For 3 years, I'd been doing mental gymnastics to make his behavior acceptable, creating these complex explanations for what were actually very simple truths. He didn't make effort because he didn't want to. He didn't prioritize me because he didn't consider me a priority. He didn't meet my needs because he wasn't interested in the work that requires. All my elaborate explanations about his stress, his childhood, his personality type, his communication style, they were just ways of avoiding these basic, painful facts. He'd do the bare minimum. Remember my birthday with a generic card, occasionally agree to plans I suggested, show up to events I'd asked him to attend, and I'd give him enormous credit for trying. I'd built him up in my mind as someone making effort because he'd done these basic, baseline things that any partner should do automatically. Meanwhile, I was planning dates, remembering details about his life, supporting his goals, managing our social calendar, doing all the emotional work. And I didn't even think of it as trying. It was just what you did when you loved someone. He'd hurt me, forget something important, cancel plans, say something dismissive. And instead of holding him accountable, I'd blame my sensitivity. I'm being too sensitive about this. I'm overreacting. I'm making too big a deal out of something small. I'd gaslight myself on his behalf, do the work of minimizing my own legitimate feelings so he'd never have to face that he'd hurt me or change his behavior. I'd become so practiced at this that I didn't even realize I was doing it anymore. It had become automatic. The math stopped adding up once I started looking at it clearly. I was putting in 90% of the effort, the planning, the emotional labor, the accommodation, the hoping, the trying, and getting back maybe 10%. And I've been calling it equal because occasionally he'd do something nice. One thoughtful gesture would erase months of taking me for granted in my mind. One good weekend would make me forget all the canceled plans that came before it. I'd been so focused on the exceptions that I'd ignored the rule, which was that I was doing almost everything alone. Sitting there in that break room, my coworker waiting for me to finish my explanation, I felt the whole carefully constructed narrative I'd been living in start to collapse. All those defenses I'd built, all those explanations I'd perfected, all those ways I'd learned to translate his indifference into care, none of them made sense anymore. Once I'd asked myself why I was working so hard to convince people he loved me, I couldn't stop asking. Why was I the only one defending this relationship? Why did everyone who cared about me have concerns I had to talk them out of? I mumbled something to my coworker about needing to get back to work and left the break room, but I couldn't focus on anything the rest of the day. That question kept circling. Why was I working this hard? What was I getting for all this effort? If I stopped doing all the translating, all the explaining, all the defending, what would be left? And I realized with creeping dread that maybe the answer was nothing. Maybe without all my interpretive labor, all my generous explanations, all my excuses, there was just someone who didn't care enough to try. Part of me wanted to push this new awareness back down, return to the comfortable script I'd been living by. It was easier to keep explaining, keep defending, keep believing my own rationalizations. Seeing clearly meant I'd have to do something about what I was seeing, and I wasn't ready for that. But I couldn't unsee it. Once you hear yourself, really hear the absurdity of trying to convince everyone that someone loves you when their actions consistently suggest otherwise, you can't go back to not hearing it. I kept catching myself over the next few days, hearing my own explanations with this new clarity. When I'd automatically start to excuse his behavior, even just in my own head, I'd stop and think, what am I doing? Why am I explaining this away? What would I think if a friend told me her partner did this? And the answer was always the same. I'd tell her she deserved better. I'd tell her his behavior wasn't okay. I'd tell her she was making excuses for the inexcusable. The clarity was almost physical, like taking off glasses I didn't know I was wearing, and suddenly seeing the world in sharp focus for the first time. Everything looked different. Not just my relationship, but my role in it. My complicity in maintaining something that wasn't working by working so hard to pretend it was. I saw our relationship for what it was, not what I'd been trying to make it. Not what I'd been telling everyone it was. Not what I'd been hoping it would become if I just tried hard enough. And the most painful part wasn't that he didn't love me enough. That hurt, yes, but it wasn't the deepest pain. The deepest pain was understanding that I'd been lying to myself about it for so long. For 3 years, I'd been making excuses, filling in his gaps with my own effort and imagination, doing the emotional work for both of us, and calling it love. Calling it partnership, calling it normal. I'd been so invested in the story I was telling about us that I'd stopped seeing what was actually there. I'd been carrying the relationship alone and pretending we were carrying it together. Doing his emotional work along with mine and convincing myself that was sustainable, that was fair, that was just how relationships worked when people loved differently. But love doesn't mean doing all the work while someone else coasts. Love doesn't mean explaining away neglect and calling it understanding. Love doesn't require constant translation for it to look like love to everyone watching. When something is real, when care is genuine, you don't need a script to defend it. You don't need to convince your mom and your friends and your therapist and random coworkers that it exists. It's just obvious, present, visible. And I'd been working so hard because it wasn't there. Because I was trying to create through explanation what didn't exist in reality. I'd been writing a narrative that had nothing to do with the actual story we were living. That moment in the break room changed everything. Even though nothing changed immediately. I didn't break up with him that day or even that week. But I stopped defending him. Stopped explaining. Stopped translating his indifference into care. And without all that interpretive labor I'd been doing, the relationship looked very different. Looked like what it had always been. Me trying desperately to make something work with someone who wasn't trying at all. The clarity didn't make it easier, but at least I was finally seeing the truth. If you've heard yourself defending someone and suddenly realized you were working too hard to convince people they care, you're not alone in that moment of clarity. Many have shared in the comments about hearing their own explanations and finally understanding they'd been lying to themselves. Sometimes seeing the truth is the first step to honoring it. If this resonates, this space continues for those who've stopped doing mental gymnastics and started seeing clearly.